Hey, good afternoon and welcome to our event on Saudi Arabia. He's been visiting the USA. He's won praise from key sectors of the US media and parts of the US foreign policy establishment. Is the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Sultan a reformer? His fans call him a courageous leader and even a revolutionary. His critics refer to him as just another Arab dictator guilty of war crimes in Yemen. The rise to power of the 32-year-old Saudi prince has generated massive media coverage, both because of his policies within Saudi Arabia and the region, but also due to his recent tour of Western capitals. Many are hailing him as a champion of women's rights and a courageous opponent of corruption. MBS, as he is widely known, is currently on a 2-week tour of the United States. But who is the real Mohammed bin Sultan? And is Saudi Arabia really on the path to reform and moderation? And what are the implications for U.S.-Saudi relations, U.S.-Middle East relations as a result of the rise to power of this new Saudi prince, the leader of one of the most important and influential countries in the region? This is the topic that brings us here today. And to help us examine it and explore it are two of my colleagues here at the Korbel School. Ambassador Gary Grappo is a career diplomat. His postings have included Nicaragua, Portugal, Jordan, Oman twice, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jerusalem. From 2003 to 2005, he was the Deputy Chief of Mission and Minister Counselor of the United States Mission in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, before being sworn as U.S. Ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman in 2006. He's also a Distinguished Fellow at our Center for Middle East Studies here at the Korbel School, where he's been teaching graduate-level courses on the region. He's a frequent contributor to the Cipher Brief and the Fair Observer, including a recent piece on Saudi Arabia, which I suspect he's going to be drawing upon for some of his remarks this afternoon. Claude is the director of the Korbel School's Human Trafficking Center and the director of the International Human Rights Degree Program. He is also the director of the Center on Rights Development, co-director of the Interdisciplinary Certificate Program in International Law and Human Rights with the Sturm College of Law. His research and expertise focus on forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, international humanitarian law of armed conflict, torture, international law and human rights law, national and homeland security, and comparative religion. And for all of those reasons, he's a perfect choice to be a co-panelist for today's topic. The format will be quite simple. Both of our panelists, including myself, will offer roughly between 10 to 15 minutes of opening remarks. Then there will be time for questions and answers. We do have somewhat of a time constriction here because Claude has another appointment at 1 o'clock that he has to leave to, and I want to allow for time so that he could participate in the question and answer session as well. So with that as a set of preliminary remarks, let me turn the floor over to Ambassador Gary Grappo. The floor is yours, Gary, for the next 15 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nader. There's no question that MBS, as you heard Nader explain, is the term most often used for the Crown Prince, is coming into this position as the Crown Prince as a genuine transformer. The question is, how is he going to transform this very hidebound traditional country? Now, typically, the crown princes and kings have been steeped in the process of leadership in Saudi Arabia, which, contrary to the belief of many, has been somewhat collegial in the fact that the senior princes would always gather with the king to hash out major issues that confronted the kingdom. He has not come from that tradition. He's only 32, which puts him in the majority of his country, that is, of 75% of Saudis who are under the age of 35. So he immediately has a connection with Saudi youth. And he's played on that, perhaps to counterbalance the fact that in some cases, we don't know exactly, he's probably alienated a significant number of the royal family many of whom are older than him, many of whom expected someone more experienced, more respected, to move into the position of crown prince and eventually king. Now, if and when he does become king, he could easily rule for 50 years, given the longevity genes of the Saud leadership. His father is probably 82 or 83, reportedly suffering from early signs of dementia, and not surprisingly, we're seeing MBS far more often taking center stage in announcing decisions and explaining positions for the Saudi government rather than his father, King Salman. He's ambitious, needless to say. He's brash, and he's begun a process of transforming the way Saudi Arabia is led. Since 1979, there have been 3 power circles in Saudi Arabia. The House of Saud, they were sort of the hardware of Saudi Arabia. They controlled defense, oil, the economy, and foreign policy. The software had been the Wahhabi religious establishment, who controlled, of course, the religious ministry, but also the justice and education ministries. I had the experience when I was there. I used to meet with the leadership of the higher education ministry to look at programs we were trying to initiate in education in Saudi Arabia. And the minister had to apologize and say that I was not able to come to his ministry, that I would have to meet with him at a hotel along with his staff, because it was being watched by the Wahhabists, who were afraid of Americans infiltrating the education system in Saudi Arabia. And then finally, the business establishment, who were basically kind of the, no pun intended, the oil. They made the economic system work beyond just the oil system. That's been turned upside down. First of all, there are the fewest number of royals in the cabinet in the history of Saudi Arabia. He is the defense minister, he's the deputy prime minister, his father, of course, being the prime minister, and there's only one other royal, who is the minister of the interior, which is considered sort of the third leg of the security establishment in Saudi Arabia. All the other members of the cabinet are technocrats whom he has named. Most of them are fairly young, and most of them owe their loyalty to him. The religious establishment is increasingly losing power. He's taken power away from the religious police, no more harassment of women or Westerners in Saudi Arabia. He's also removed some of the power, the religious power, of the Wahhabist leaders by claiming he wants to take Saudi Arabia back to the pre-1979 period, when Saudi Arabia religiously was a more moderate country. It was still pretty traditional and conservative, but not as outwardly conservative as it is today. He has said that he wants to project a more moderate image of Islam in Saudi Arabia. So it's pretty clear that the religious establishment is on the way out. The business establishment has really become simply, I would say, probably something like a lobbyist organization. On foreign policy, unlike his predecessors, he does not seem to be very collegial in the sense of reaching out for advice. He's very proactive, to the point of being perhaps an interventionist, and some people have even accused him of being volatile. He's responsible for getting his country into several foreign policy messes / embarrassments. The messes, of course, are the political and humanitarian disaster that we know as the Yemen Civil War. He has unnecessarily provoked this fallout with a fellow GCC member, Qatar, and brought along 2 other GCC states, the UAE and Bahrain, as well as Egypt, to support him in that effort, which could very easily lead to the collapse of probably one of the few Arab multilateral organizations that has any effect in the Middle East. And then, of course, he engaged in this very bizarre incident in which he invited the Prime Minister of Lebanon to Riyadh for consultations, then immediately placed him under house arrest and forced him to deliver through the media a statement of resignation, which, of course, the Prime Minister quickly revoked once he returned to Lebanon. So these raise the specter of his inexperience when it comes to foreign policy making, and has raised many, many questions, not only among the traditionalists in Saudi Arabia, but even abroad, about the direction that he wants to take Saudi Arabia. And finally, I'll just note that he has taken a very aggressive position, not surprisingly, against Iran. Those of you who watched him interviewed on 60 Minutes, by the way, he came across, I think, quite well, quite effectively. He made the comment with regard to nuclear weapons that if Iran goes nuclear, so will we. And he has also taken a position of being strongly opposed to the agreement that the P5 struck with Iran with regard to their nuclear weapons. So on the one hand, he'd like to see the agreement overturned, but on the other hand, he said if Iran goes toward producing or moves toward producing nuclear weapons, then Saudi Arabia will as well. And by the way, without any question, they have the wherewithal to acquire the technology for producing nuclear weapons. They probably subsidize the nuclear weapons program of Pakistan. They're well familiar with it. They visit Pakistan often. They have a close relationship with Pakistan. And if it were necessary, I have no doubt that they could acquire all the technology necessary to produce or at least acquire nuclear weapons. So this has created a bit of a difficult position for Saudi Arabia in that it has moved now into a position, at least in the Arab world, of unchallenged leadership. It used to be Egypt. Egypt was obviously facing its own problems, own challenges, and doesn't have near the clout that it had before. And it's now Saudi Arabia, with its wealth and influence in the Muslim world, that has risen to a clear position of, I can't say hegemony, because they have very weak military forces, very weak military forces. Despite having spent on the basis of their budget, that they have the third highest military budget in the world as a percentage of their total budget, second only to the United States and I want to say China, but I can't be sure. So they don't have a very strong military, but they're very influential, of course, because of Islam and because of the wealth. Now, as I said before, he's upset the leadership, he's upset the Saudi royal family. So where does he turn for his support? Well, as I also indicated earlier, he's a very young man, and his economic and social program are geared toward reaching out to young people, supporting young people. He has dropped many of the restrictions, for example, on entertainment. In fact, he now claims he wants to see Saudi Arabia become an entertainment hub. He's building this city of the future up in the northwestern part of the country near the borders with Jordan and Egypt called Neom. He wants it to be a media and entertainment center, a biotech center, a high-tech center. So he has many, many plans to change Saudi Arabia's economy from an oil-based economy to something else. So he's also, of course, lifted the restriction on women driving. That was bound to happen sooner or later. He has indicated that he wants to increase the level of employment of women in Saudi Arabia from it's about 18 or 19% of the workforce to, he says, a third of the workforce, which and this would be by the year 2030, which would be an amazing transformation for a country, as I said before, steeped in tradition and where you do not see women very commonly in the workforce. The suspicion is that the longer he is crown prince, or most certainly if he becomes the king, he will move women into ministerial positions on his cabinet. He's made it very, very clear. He wants to see women play a much stronger role in Saudi Arabia's economy. He wants to provide much greater opportunity for employment of young people. So with that kind of support, it's going to be very, very hard for the resistors in the royal family to oppose Mohammed bin Salman. I do expect him to be quite successful transforming the country. The one problem he's going to have is because he does not appear to take the consultative approach in terms of working not only inside the country but also outside the country, that he's going to encounter some problems. We've already seen that in the way that he has cracked down on human rights advocates, on journalists, bloggers, and others who seem to challenge the traditional Saudi system. He has been quite heavily criticized, I think, by, and I'm sure Claude will address it shortly, by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International for the very harsh way that he's dealt with opposition. The last point that I'm going to make is he realized quite quickly that he needed to establish a very strong relationship with the United States. President Trump, when he came into office, also wanted to establish a stronger relationship with Saudi Arabia than had President Obama. That relationship had suffered a bit. In fact, not a bit, significantly, during President Obama's terms of office. And the two leaders have worked fairly closely in strengthening that relationship. The concern that I have is that the kind of relationship that this administration has formed with Saudi Arabia is very different from the kind of relationship that previous administrations, excluding President Obama, had with the Al Saud. It was very much a consultative type of relationship. The two sides talked very, very often at various levels before taking action that would affect the region. In the current case, under President Trump, it appears the administration is deferring to Saudi Arabia. And that's dangerous in my view, particularly given some of the attitudes that Mohammed bin Salman has exhibited and more of some of the actions he's taken. For example, in Yemen, and the very harsh position he's taken vis-a-vis Iran. So I'm concerned about that. There's this relationship that appears to have developed between Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman. I don't believe Mr. Kushner has much understanding or knowledge of Saudi Arabia, much less the broader Middle East, and could easily be manipulated. Moreover, the United States still does not have an ambassador in Riyadh today. Typically, we've had ambassadors who've had very close relationships with the president. Well, we've got the president's son-in-law, who certainly has a close relationship with the president, but we've also got someone who does not understand the mysteries of what we used to call, those of us who served in Saudi Arabia, is the Magic Kingdom. It is a very difficult place in which to operate with all kinds of competing and conflicting interests, the traditionalists and the modernists. I'll close by saying one thing. The one thing he is doing that is classic for Saudi kings since King Faisal is reforming from the top down. Reforms in Saudi Arabia, when they have happened in the course of the last 40 to 50 years, have always been from the top down. Unlike in most democratic countries, they come from the bottom up. And we've always thought that to penetrate this hidebound society, that you would have to have a very strong king who would have to impose the kind of change necessary to move Saudi Arabia into the modern era, which he clearly seems to want to do. I'm going to stop right there and turn the program over to Claude.
Thanks, Gary. So thank you, Nader, for the invitation. Gary, always a pleasure to hear you. I came here directly from a class that I teach on Thursday mornings from 9 to noon on torture, which is, strangely enough, a very popular course here. And then my time is relatively short because then I have to go to the clinic part of my other course on forced labor and human trafficking. Both courses reminded me of Saudi Arabia. So that's where I guess that's a good place as any to start. So, you know, prior to his current appointments, MBS was head of the Council for Economic Affairs and Development, which is referred to, which oversees the kingdom's economic affairs and ultimately shaping its political and security policies. And while leading the council, MBS unveiled an ambitious and wide-ranging plan to end Saudi Arabia's economic reliance on oil, which you've heard before, and to bring economic and social change to the kingdom, all things sounding very good and probably necessary, because as we've seen, some of the other oil states start to become aware that the reliance on oil is a, well, maybe not in our lifetimes, yours and mine at least, is a short-term event, and if they're going to survive on the global economic process, they're going to have to shift their economy. Within the plan, the prince envisioned changing the education curriculum in order to increase specifically women's participation in the workforce and create jobs for young people through investment in the entertainment sector, as Gary has already spoken to. And in addition to the shifts in the government power, the prince spearheaded the Qatar boycott in June 2017, and in September, the king ended a long-standing ban granting women the right to drive, which we keep on hearing over and over again as though that is the sine qua non of liberation somehow. Maybe that's speaking specifically to an American audience who has a love affair with a car, which is why we don't know about self-driving cars or anything like that, because obviously freedom and the right to drive are one and the same. So that makes sense. It was interesting to note, as I again noted in October, the prince called for a return to, quote, moderate Islam, or at least the Saudi version of moderate Islam, to modernize Saudi Arabia, which includes women's emancipation, which is the right to vote, as though that, again, is the only notation. So we got the right to vote and driving, and that constitutes the entire concept of women's emancipation. A reintroduction, again, of music and cinema, which I'm sure Hollywood and Bollywood are probably thrilled about, and an attacking a widespread corruption, which also sounds very good. And as you know, as the prince declared in the 60 Minutes interview, women are, quote, absolutely equal to men. And he continued to describe new rights women enjoy in Saudi Arabia, including the right to pursue new careers, run for office, the right to drive, and much more. So it paints a very rosy picture, which you probably already guessed by my tone I'm not buying into. The changes over the past year led 60 Minutes to refer to MBS's policy as revolutionary. That was a bit much for me, and that these steps towards gender equality have been described as a new era of tolerance and openness. At that point, my gag reflex has kicked in. Originally, those little added things I didn't actually put into my speech. I just can't help myself here, so Nader, I apologize. So, however, by celebrating these moves, many seem to gloss over the country's really more problematic track record, conflating headline-grabbing moments with progress that have remained unrealized in reality. For instance, Prince Salman has introduced an ambitious Vision 2030 plan, which looks interesting and seeks to transform the country's economy and civic sectors. But in the past few years, the kingdom's human rights violations have only seemed to have been escalating. The Saudi Arabia of 2018 does not look very much different, in my view, than that of the past. While Prince Salman bin Salman has said that the country is close to achieving gender equality, that one really got to me, the reality is that women are still second-class citizens. I would probably lower that class rating for a staggering array of everyday activities and need to first get male permission on many activities, day-to-day living activities, and who face segregation in restaurants, in clothing stores, and in most public spaces, for that matter. According to Amnesty International, in the organization's 2017-2018 Human Rights Report, authorities were identified for, quote, severely restricting freedom of expression, association, and assembly. That's this year, right? Many human rights defenders, it goes on to say, and critics were detained, and some were sentenced to lengthy prison terms after unfair trials. Several activists were executed, and many more were sentenced to death following a grossly unfair trials before the specialized criminal court known as the SCC. Torture and other ill treatment of detainees remains common and customary. Despite limited reforms, women faced systematic discrimination in law and practice and were inadequately protected against sexual and other violence. The authorities used the death penalty extensively, carrying out scores of executions. The Saudi-led coalition continued to commit serious violations of international law in Yemen, end quote. So if human rights defenders applied for a permit, for instance, for their organization to work within the framework of the law, their application would be almost automatically rejected out of hand. However, if they continued to work in the field of human rights, they would be arrested one by one for membership in an unlicensed organization, which keeps on going on. The association, as an example, the Association for Civil and Political Rights in Saudi Arabia, the ACPRA, is a human rights organization that had all of its founding members arrested and tried on false and fabricated charges before the terrorist court. Writers, academics, online activists, and clerics have been among those arrested recently. In 1 week alone in September 2017, more than 20 prominent human rights defenders were detained following a wave of house raids and arrests. Women human rights defenders were also subjected to silencing after being summoned for interrogations where they were asked to sign pledges to refrain from engaging in advocacy online. On the day of the announcement of this famed announcement about driving, on the day of the announcement of the royal decree, I love that, the royal decree to repeal the ban on women driving, the royal court phoned several prominent women rights defenders who advocated for women driving and warned them from commenting on the royal decision or they would face legal measures. The U.S. State Department echoed Amnesty International's report stating that the lack of legal means to choose government, universal rights restrictions, and pervasive gender discrimination are the most critical human rights violations committed by the kingdom, and they're our ally. The State Department also noted other human rights problems, including denial of due process, arbitrary arrest, and detention. And since 2015, as we already know, Saudi Arabia has led a U.S.-backed coalition to defeat the Houthi rebels who gained power during the country's civil war, creating what has been called by the UN a humanitarian crisis. More than 10,000 civilian deaths have been recorded throughout the war, the majority from coalition airstrikes. Such indiscriminate bombing has largely destroyed Yemen's infrastructure, leading to a lack of water and sanitation throughout the country, which has in turn caused an unprecedented cholera crisis affecting more than 1 million people. The Saudi-led coalition has also blockaded ports throughout Yemen, preventing humanitarian aid from reaching communities and deepening a famine that affects millions of people. This really blatant disregard for human rights is mirrored back in Saudi Arabia on a regular basis. Executions in the countries have doubled over the past 8 months. There are dozens of capital offenses in Saudi Arabia, including homosexuality, atheism, and adultery. Dozens of human rights advocates are also serving long-term sentences. And as we've seen in the prince's decision to detain Saudi elites, granted, we thought it was kind of nice. It was at the Ritz-Carlton and other very fancy places. That would be my idea of jail if given the choice. However, obviously they were on allegations of corruption without due process. Remember that. We like kind of the outcome, right? Because we go, well, these are rich, greedy bastards that he's finally gotten to. But the reality is they were all denied a due process. The prince's record is really questionable on this issue. While every new right for women in the country is undoubtedly important, in reality, the country's status on gender equality is significantly deficient. Moreover, the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia has markedly deteriorated, and there has been a renewed crackdown against human rights defenders since the accession of the Crown Prince in June of 2017. There are all these issues that we won't have time to go into, but the whole issue of the protection of laborers in Saudi Arabia, like many of the other states. I don't know the percentage in Saudi Arabia, but I know in Qatar, for instance, 90% of the labor is foreign labor. And so that's a fairly common process by which the majority of the work that is being done on a day-to-day basis is brought in from the Philippines, from Indonesia, and other places. The rights of those peoples are extremely limited. We tend to think, or we'd like to think, at least philosophically, that human rights goes with the individual wherever they are going on the planet. Not true. Well, it is true, but it is actually not the practice. And so what we have in Saudi Arabia, as with many other places, is that we have something called the kafala system, which is to say you have a sponsorship and then you get your visa and you're required to work for a certain individual. You can't get an exit visa until you are given that permission by the person you're working for. You can only imagine the exploitation that then takes place, not in terms of both lack of payment, overwork, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, and in fact leading up to and including human trafficking. This has been going on, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight in this. The common practice has been successful, which is to say you bring in a number of workers from one country and you have them work for you, let's say from the Philippines, and then after a while there's unrest and they tend to start to organize. Well, then you deport all of them and then you bring in Indonesians. So you pay attention very closely to what is going on amongst the worker class. There is a class of people that is very well protected, right? You're born into it and you get taken care of from birth to death, everything, right? But the actual work, everyday work that is being done by a group of people that are exploited, and I don't see any change in the fact that they will continue to be severely exploited. Perhaps what the prince is trying to suggest is that the women who are part of the married to the elite class will get some protections, but I'm not expecting anything moving down that chain into the actual folks who do the day-to-day work. So then there's this one other piece that goes on that actually the United States happens in the concept of sex tourism. It's added to this concept of what they call summer marriages. I don't remember exactly the term of art right now, in which Saudi men then can go marry a young girl for the summer and then, or whatever period of time, and then be able to gain a fairly quick divorce. This is an increasing practice that is common in Saudi Arabia and the countries in the region. So I don't come necessarily with happy news about this new face. I think the optics are great. He is handsome. He is dashing. Look at that. I mean, how could you not like that guy, right? And he is really appealing, rightfully so, to the folks that he wants to appeal to. So I'm going to end with this. My generation used to say, don't trust anyone over 30. Let me reframe that. I would suggest that in this case, don't trust anybody in their 30s. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Claude. Well, is MBS the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Sultan a reformer? Well, I'm sure we all certainly hope so. God only knows how much reform is needed in Saudi Arabia. The question is there evidence to substantiate that belief or claim? And I want to similarly argue that I think there are grounds for deep skepticism. So what I want to do is I want to do two broad things in the next 15 minutes. I want to talk about the framing of this particular visit by a the Saudi Crown Prince to the United States. I want to frame it historically. And I also want to talk about his recent tour in the United States, who he's meeting with, and what this really tells us about U.S. Middle East relations and how deeply problematic it always has been, and it will continue to be as long as we, I think, continue this particular cycle of policy making. So MBS has been hailed as a modernizer, a reformer, a progressive, a fighter of corruption, a new liberal voice in a sea of darkness. A couple of years ago, we had the honor of hosting Abdullah Al-Aryan, who's a young historian at Georgetown University, Qatar. And around the time that MBS was rising to prominence, he did something quite, I think, significant. As a good historian, he sort of looked back at the New York Times coverage of Saudi Arabia and how the New York Times framed the coming to power of a new monarch in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I want to go over some of the slides because he wrote about this article, so if you're interested in this, send me an email. I'll send you the actual article he wrote. I've summarized this in the form of a PowerPoint presentation. And so, how has the New York Times, described this question of secession in Saudi Arabia over the course of the last roughly 70 years? Now let me see, why is this not working the way it's supposed to? In terms of the, there's supposed to be a much clearer image. Let me see if this helps. Okay, maybe that's a bit better. Let me see. Okay, so in 1953, a new king comes to power in Saudi Arabia. And what does the New York Times actually say about this? It describes the king in 1953, King Saud, as more progressive and international-minded than his autocratic father. 1960, King Saud has increasingly assumed the role of a liberal champion of constitutional reform. Hope, the only one problem, the Constitution of Saudi Arabia or the basic laws of Saudi Arabia don't exist at that time. They don't come into power until 1992. But still, there's this sense of, look, we have a new person at the head of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He's a liberal reformer. 1963, during the height of the Cold War, Prince Faisal is sort of described also in sort of heroic terms, a bulwark against Arab nationalism and Nasserism. He's pursuing a burst of social reform and economic development. 1964, King Faisal is described as a modernizer and a reformer. Again in 1964, major changes are coming in Saudi Arabia, we're told. King Faisal was once described as an ascetic with only one wife who lives on grilled meat and boiled vegetables and makes a fetish of moderation. 1975, an obituary reads that Faisal, rich and powerful, leads Saudis into the 20th century. And moving forward, you continually to see a very similar framing of the question of secession in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I don't have time to go through all of the slides. I want to thank Zaid for going through the trouble of actually producing these slides from the document that Abdullah Al-Arian put together. But you constantly see the same narrative. And this is interesting to think about against the backdrop of what is happening today with the visit by MBS. Very similar sort of terminology and framing. A modernizing force, reform-minded king is coming to power. All of these themes, King Fahd in 1982 depicted as a leading figure in a progressive, modernizing faction within the tradition-minded monarchy. And you can go through actually almost every decade and consistently see this type of narrative. Saudi air urges reform and turn from the U.S. In 2002, in the lead up to the war, you see a similar framing. This is when Thomas Friedman emerges on the scene. And I'll say something about him in a moment because he's very much involved in this narrative of presenting the current crown prince in a very positive light. And you go right through the years, and it's quite shocking and quite, I think, revealing at the same time, is that if you go through all of these articles in the New York Times in terms of how Saudi Arabia is framed and presented in the United States, almost every year you get some sort of, narrative that Saudi Arabia is modernizing, it's reforming, there is, signs of optimism and hope on the horizon. But of course, after every single year, starting in 1953, not a lot changes. In fact, in many ways, one could make the point that it gets worse after 1979 in terms of the alleged reform that is taking place. Thomas Friedman then gets involved and is sort of one of the biggest sort of promoters of this alleged hardline rejection or counter trend that Saudi Arabia is going through. He wrote this very famous piece just last year where he, describes what's happening in Saudi Arabia, and particularly MBS, in such glowing terms in this very controversial piece that the Saudi embassy was actually distributing and circulating the article. as he hails the new arrival of another reformer who allegedly this time is going to do what previous heads of state did not do or would not do. And so when I went through this article and then I juxtaposed it to what's happening right now, it's pretty clear that this is a very old story. And it's an old story that I think illuminates how allies of the United States often get the benefit of the doubt and they're portrayed in ways that I think do not reflect the reality of what's actually happening on the ground. And so I think that's something to take into consideration as we think about this particular head of state or Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia moving forward. And so let me say something now very briefly about one of the themes that have already been discussed, the question of reforming Islam, presenting a more moderate, tolerant reform of Islam that allegedly MBS, Prince Mohammed bin Sultan, is trying to promote. God knows we need a reform of the interpretation of Islam in Saudi Arabia. The question is it actually happening? And so one of the comments that was actually referred to by Gary Grappo that MBS has made on this particular theme was that 1979 is the key moment. MBS described 1979 as the year when Saudi radicalization was born, as if to suggest that somehow the country had been some sort of island of tolerance, moderation, and liberal Islam prior to 1979. Go back and look at the teachings, the dissemination, the interpretation, the preaching of official Saudi Wahhabi Islam prior to 1979, and there's very little evidence to suggest that somehow in the pre-1979 period things were much better in terms of the actual ideological content of the Islam that was preached both in Saudi Arabia and around the world. Now it is true after 1979 things got much worse, partly as a result of the perceived challenge of the Iranian Revolution, that there was a significant uptake and increase in the proliferation of a much more ultra-conservative and toxic interpretation of Islam. But prior to 1979, I think that claim does not stand up to critical scrutiny. And of course, this is one reason why Saudi Arabia is such, I think, a potential destabilizing force, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. I've seen figures that compare the amount of money that the Soviet Union spent during the Cold War to promote communism with the amount of money that Saudi Arabia has spent over the last 50 or 60 years promoting Wahhabi Islam. $7 billion the Soviet Union allegedly has spent during the Cold War promoting communism, $100 billion and counting by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, promoting a particularly very virulent, ultra-conservative and intolerant interpretation of Islam that is really now, we're seeing its effects. It's deeply connected to the rise of Islamic radicalism. It's a deeply, corroded and corrupted, previously much more tolerant and inclusive societies around the Islamic world. I've been spending a lot of time in Southeast Asia and Malaysia, where you can see the corrupting influence of the spread of Wahhabi Islam. And so this has been historically a big problem. Now, with respect to reforming Islam, the dissident Saudi scholar and anthropologist Madawi al-Rashid has argued, and I would say quite rightly argued, that if MBS is really serious about getting the country to embrace a moderate form of Islam, then he must do sort of what's kind of obvious if you want to promote a more moderate interpretation of Islam. Allow Saudi clerics and other thinkers of different denominations to debate foundational texts and Islamic norms in an open environment. Is there any evidence that this is happening? Instead, I think the evidence suggests that it's not happening, and what's actually happening is a counter-trend. Since last September, MBS has sent hundreds of clerics, intellectuals, and Islamic thinkers to prison under the pretext of fighting terrorism and extremism. But many of those people who've been sent to prison are not these extremist Wahhabi clerics. Yes, some of them have been rounded up, but also many independent, dissident theologians and political reformers have also been thrown into jail. And that raises, I think, serious questions about the agenda here for Islamic reform. Salman al-Auda, a dissident cleric, his alleged crime was tweeting that he hopes that Saudi Arabia and Qatar can patch up their differences. Thrown in jail. Issam al-Zamil, a writer and economist who also took to Twitter, questioning this privatization plan that MBS has suggested, raising doubts about the plan to privatize a portion of Saudi Aramco, the state oil monopoly. Ziad bin Nahit, a poet, also thrown in jail for not towing the line on Qatar. Saleh al-Sheikhi, a Saudi columnist, just last month appears on a television program and criticizes corruption in the royal court, sentenced to 5 years in jail. And so one would sort of assume that if there was a serious commitment to, I think, reform and openness and moderation, the first thing that should be asked of MBS is to free these people from jail. I think that would be a good test. There's also the deeper question of, you know, the very toxic curriculum that is taught in Saudi schools in terms of how Christians and Jews and Shia and Sufis and others are portrayed. That would be, I think, something to look for. And also the question of freedom of religion. You know, Saudi Arabia, in contrast to some of the countries in its own neighborhood, other Gulf countries, is still the only country in the Muslim world where non-Muslim places of worship are not allowed. Even in neighboring Gulf countries, Hindu temples and Christian churches exist. That would be a good test, I think, of moderation. Now, Claude talked extensively about the human rights record in Saudi Arabia. I don't want to repeat what he said. It just so happened today, while I was preparing for these remarks, Amnesty International issued a press release about the MBS tour in the USA called "Saudi Arabia, No Amount of Flattering PR Can Hide the Human Rights Crackdown Under the Reformer Crown Prince." The Crown Prince. Basically, the statement said that actually the human rights situation has gotten worse since MBS came to power, not better. Executions have actually doubled, coinciding with the time that he came to power roughly 8 months ago. And so there's a lot of, I think, room for skepticism. Now, some people will say, look, it's too early to judge. Let's give him a chance. Trying to reform a country as deeply conservative and authoritarian as Saudi Arabia is like trying to redirect the Titanic. You can't do it overnight. It takes time. But I think one of the, again, you know, it's so interesting that in this debate we sort of have forgotten our own political history and lessons of the development of democracy that we so cherish and frequently sort of enunciate in terms of what we consider to be our own founding values. So in the United States, we're frequently taught about how wise the founding fathers were when they promoted a system where the concentration of political power in the hands of one group or one individual is very dangerous. We pride ourselves in the concept of the separation of powers. We pride ourselves in the concept of checks and balances. We pride ourselves in the concept of political transparency and a free press, not in the consolidation of power in the hands of one person. We know historically that this is a recipe for a disaster. So I'm not sure why in this particular case, as this one young 32-year-old inexperienced kid with no political experience is concentrating all of this political power, people are viewing this as sort of a wonderful development, as if the entire course of everything that we know about the history of democratic development and just government has been cast aside, and in this one particular case, 32-year-old MBS is going to buck the trend. So I think there is, you know, cause for considerable concern here. And let me just end lastly with the tour that he's currently on. Just 2 days ago, a journalist in Beirut called me up and she said she has a leaked copy of MBS's agenda here in the United States. I printed it off and I looked through it. This got written up in The Independent yesterday, so you can look at the article that summarizes this itinerary. And so when I was going through the itinerary, the first thing that sort of struck me is how long it is, 36 pages. And the list of who he's meeting is quite astonishing and quite revealing. This is just a partial list. He's meeting effectively with every significant and important political, intellectual, and economic leader of both political parties across the country. In fact, it's tough to find someone who he's not meeting with. He even has a dinner arrangement set up with Oprah Winfrey. Now that is actually quite revealing. It's not just there on the agenda. I think when Oprah Winfrey is on the tour here, it suggests to me, as I was thinking about this particular tour, how deep, how vast, how extensive is the ties between the United States and Saudi Arabia. It's not just the United States and the Saudi Arabia. What it reminded me of, this itinerary, is how deep are the ties between the United States and authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. And I'll say something about that in a moment by virtue of a set of closing remarks. So when you look at who's on the agenda, support for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and this particular Crown Prince is a bipartisan issue. Democrats and Republicans and people who are not necessarily political but have economic interests, intellectual interests, there's a broad consensus that this is a country whose leadership and whose policies we should support. But I think it's a view of the Middle East that has lasted for a very long time, and it's basically a view of the Middle East that I think mistakenly believes that we are best served as a country by supporting authoritarian regimes, hoping that these authoritarian regimes will stabilize the region, will moderate the region, will secure our interests. But I think if there's any sort of argument that can be advanced conclusively, that this particular policy has not served us well. The problem in the region, the instability of the region, as someone who's studied the region for most of my adult life, is precisely and exactly the persistence of authoritarian rule, the corruption, the nepotism, the destructive policies that this region has been facing as a direct result of these authoritarian regimes. Some, not all of them, but some who are strongly backed by the West. I think Saudi Arabia is one of the most important allies that we have. And this faith that we've put in these authoritarian regimes continues to disappoint. As you saw from the slideshow that I presented, we've been hailing reform in Saudi Arabia for over 60 years now, and it hasn't come about. To think that somehow this Crown Prince is going to change everything, I think, is wishful thinking. And this reminds me very much of another episode where, for those people who are sort of roughly in my age cohort, maybe a bit older, you might remember a man by the name of Mohammed Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was also hailed when he would come to the United States as a modernizer, as a liberal, as an open-minded king. He spoke English, he spoke French, he purchased our arms, he protected our interests. He was, presiding, as Jimmy Carter famously said just before the Iranian Revolution, the Shah of Iran was presiding over an island of stability in a troubled part of the world. This was just on the eve of the Iranian Revolution. And so we've been hailing these reformers, these modernizers, for a very long time, and it's the same old sad story. At some point in time, I think U.S. policy is going to have to try and shift, and we're going to have to try and invest in the peoples of the region, not in the dictators that rule over them. I think until that shift happens, I hope I'm alive to see it. Given the list of people who are on the speaking tour here, it's probably going to be a very long time before there's a shift in policy because of the broad-based support that we have and continue to have with authoritarian regimes. But until there is that shift, I don't think we're going to be able to get our relationship with the Middle East, with the Islamic world, on a better track. This type of embracing of authoritarian regimes does have consequences. It breeds resentment. We can't see it here, but let's not forget, 9/11. 15 out of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. Are any of the reforms that the Crown Prince is suggesting going to really change that equation in terms of trying to provide young people with some sort of political opening where they can voice their ideas? I remain skeptical, and so that's why I hope I'm wrong. I hope maybe in this particular case, given all of the weight of evidence and everything that we've learned from the history of good governance, that the current Crown Prince is a different political actor. He's going to buck the trend. But if I had to bet, I wouldn't bet on him. Thank you. And so we have time for questions and answers. Claude, you got 4 minutes, so we'll allow you to take the first few questions before you have to depart to your next appointment. So the floor is open.
I have to say that Gary reminded me after I said this about the note about summer marriages. He reminded me that in fact there are a phenomenon called 24-hour marriages that is a popular modality in the region as well. And before I leave, I want to say I've got 2 research assistants who did a fabulous job helping me pull together all sorts of articles, and they put together a little bibliography of where I got my sources for on my brief remarks. So you're more than welcome to pick them up. So my thanks to Samantha too, and to Lindsay Posmanek for helping out at the beginning of this week to get this done. So
floor is open. Yeah. First question.
I don't really have a question. I'd like to make a statement. I'd like to thank the three of you. I came here very reluctantly with my friends after having lived in Saudi Arabia for 4 years.
Could you use the microphone, because we're recording this and we'd like to get you on film. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really just have a statement to make to the three of you. I was reluctant to come here with my friends, but we love coming to these studies and these briefings. And the reason I was reluctant was I expected to hear a lot of cheerleading, like this list that you've got up on the wall. And so I want to thank you, having lived in Saudi, having traveled extensively in the Middle East. I want to thank you for what I consider all three of you giving a very realistic appraisal.
Thank you. Okay. At the back, yeah, Colin.
Yeah, thank you all very much for your comments. I wanted to ask a question, and this is for all of you, about actually the feasibility of weaning the Saudi economy off of its dependence on oil and gas, especially for export revenue. You know, if we think that these reforms and the desire to reshape the economy and the educational system are designed in principle to deal with this issue of this youth bulge and providing meaningful opportunities for young people to engage in society, perhaps more on the side of the economy than in the political realm, do we have any kind of models that we can look to suggest that an economy at this level of development, this level of dependence on oil and gas, is going to be successful in its attempts to reform? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Gary or Claude, do you want to take on that question?
My focus is not so much clearly on economics, but on human rights. But it's, I would say that the easy answer is no, I haven't, and yet the attempt has to be made. I don't think they have a choice. So to move, and I suspect what they and Gary knows much more about this than I do. That the only place for them to go, considering their natural resources and other kind of resources, would be into the service economy, which they are more than capable of doing. I think they would have to make a different also kind of reform, which is to say that the elite educated class have gotten a free ride and having not to do very much with their lives whatsoever. So let me be blunt, we've got a very lazy educated class who will then, if they can be weaned away from that sense of intense privilege, which is really remarkable, to say, actually, guess what? You're going to have to actually work for a living. You actually have to go to the office and actually show up for more than an hour before you go to lunch for the rest of the afternoon sensibilities. Then maybe so, because it's two parts that I can say: weaning away from a particular resource and trying to move from, and it's very difficult. The United States knows this, right? When we got away from steel and everything else and moved into the service economy, that's been rough, and it's still not over, right? And it's been going on for a long time. So that's going to be hard. But they have an additional problem that in many ways we didn't have, which is to say a population who is, just being blunt, who isn't used to working.
Gary?
Claude is certainly right about the Saudi work ethic, although it's not lunch where they go, it's usually their private business. So they only spend maybe an hour or two in their government job, and then they'll spend some time in their own private businesses. When the Vision 2030 plan was promulgated, and the goal of reducing Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil to something around 50% of its GDP, the expectation was that the price of oil would remain as low as it was when the plan came out, which is in the $30 to $40 range. There was some hope of achieving that when the price was that low. But as we've begun to see over the course of the last couple of years, the price of oil has begun to rise, and now it's in the range of, I think, what, $60 a barrel, and likely to go up, if only slowly, certainly not as quickly as the Saudis would like to see it. In that case, I find it highly unlikely that they will be able to wean themselves from oil by 2030. Clearly, over the long term, they have no choice. And NMBS has been right to acknowledge that, and he's looking at ways to diversify the economy, including, and this is not a joke, tourism, which they could develop. There are actually quite a number of fascinating archaeological sites in Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, I find it highly unlikely that they're going to be able to wean themselves from oil. The most likely scenario is that they will push even more extensively downstream in the oil industry and will be able to capture some of the opportunities in the downstream oil industry. But it's hard to imagine in the next 12 years that they're going to move off of a primarily oil-dependent economy.
The other point that I would add is that there's a deep question of the political stability and legitimacy of the regime coming into question if you begin this economic transformation. Because the regime funds itself by a set of patron-clientel sort of relationships where you just throw out the money. So if you recall during the Arab Spring, when it was coming to Saudi Arabia, how did the Saudis respond? They just spent the money to buy people's loyalty. So if you start to sort of undergo this type of economic restructuring, not only does it require what I think Claude was hinting at, a complete readjustment and realignment in terms of culture, in terms of habits, in terms of sort of expectations, but also the actual stability of the regime in terms of buying off sectors of its society to keep it happy will come into question. Now, theoretically, it could be done. I think it's going to have to, be done at some point, but I'm not sure if any of us are going to be around at that time to sort of see it happen.
In addition, if I put on, in addition to my comparative religion hat, I have to, my own sense is that if Nader is correct in talking about the negative impact worldwide on, of Wahhabism, but I think that if that is not addressed within Saudi Arabia, that has its tentacles in every element of what we're talking about here. And so the idea of switching out of an oil economy into a service economy or something else means foreigners and lots of highly educated people, not a working class that you can keep under thumb, which then will also threaten the conservative religious establishment. So I can't, it's sort of like a post-Westphalian, trying to imagine a post-Westphalian world. For me to try to imagine a post-Wahhabist Saudi Arabia is
not dependent on oil.
Not dependent on oil. It's just inconceivable to me. So I still see that as the root problem, and a liberal economy suggests liberal thinking, which doesn't sit well.
Yes, question, you at the front.
It's always been my understanding. It's always been my understanding that the Saudi royalty pretty much depends on the support of the Wahhabis. And that's the reason that they pretty much do what they do with them. They don't have much of a choice, because if the Wahhabis go against them, they're gone. Am I wrong?
Well, Gary has spoken to this. There's an attempt now to rein in the conservative clerical establishment and sort of put some, restrictions on their ability to, well, that's the question. How far has it gone?
Okay, I see. When Ibn Saud founded the modern state of Saudi Arabia, he had no overarching ideology for unifying the country except Wahhabism. And so he co-opted the Ikhwan, which is the Brotherhood, not to be confused with the Muslim Brotherhood that we know today, to support him. And they provided the ideological foundation for the modern state of Saudi Arabia. And so to a certain extent, you're right, that this is the underlying ideology of Saudi Arabia. The question is, does Mohammed bin Salman truly want to upset that? He certainly has begun to marginalize some of the Wahhabist leaders within the country. Now, can he effectively break that? Not in the next 5 or 10 years, but as I said before, the guy's 32, he could be king for 50 years. Yeah, maybe he could, but it would be a major transformation for that country. It would be a shock to the country. Now, he has right now a sympathetic generation of young Saudis behind him. That's not to say they're going to turn their back on Islam. Of course not. But this sort of monochromatic version of Islam that the Wahhabists adhere to, quite possibly he might be able to colorize that. Claude mentioned, by the way, some of the oppression, and Nader as well, the oppression of religious minorities in the country. The most oppressed religious minority in Saudi Arabia are the Shia. There are probably between 1.5, 1.7 million Shia Muslims in Saudi Arabia, almost all of whom are in the eastern province, where almost all the oil is. They can't even have their own mosques. They have to worship in community centers and homes and things of that nature. There are a lot of changes that could be undertaken by this young man. We have to remember, A, he ain't king yet. His father's in charge still. And B, he's only been crown prince for a little over, well, maybe a year now, maybe not even. So he's just getting started. I don't think that he is going to enact a lot of the changes, the social and cultural changes we would like to see. It's too much a shock to the system. Over the course of time, potentially. Is it going to be the sort of democracy that we would love to embrace in the Middle East? No. It's one thing that the Al Saud are not going to do is share power. They will try to make people better off. They'll try to make the country more prosperous, certainly more secure, and by that measure, make themselves more secure. They are not in the business of sharing power, which does present the challenge that Nader said, at what point does the United States begin to question its relationship with the kingdom?
Okay, we got a lot of hands and little time, but let's go here at the front, and then we'll go in the back.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief.
Thanks.
Nader, you made the point that much of the turmoil in the Middle East is due to us, the U.S., supporting this stream of authoritarian regimes. I might make the point that that's true in the world, not necessarily just in the Middle East, but we do that, and we support our favorite dictator, and then we justify it by saying, as you pointed out, well, they're going to modernize things, they're reformers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got to do that, and that's what everybody on your slide is doing right now, to feel good about that. How does any of that change? Yeah. How do we move? Because we say Saudi Arabia is going to change under this new crown prince, but we have a significant role, as you pointed out. How do we possibly initiate change? In this habit we have of supporting the dictator of the year.
Yeah. Just a clarification, I didn't mean to imply or state that the reason why the Middle East is in turmoil is because of our support for Middle Eastern authoritarian regimes. The region is in deep chaos largely because of the corrupt management of these regimes by the ruling post-colonial elite. But our support for many of these characters has made things worse. That's where I stand on this issue. How do we bring about change? It's a great question, We thought that with respect to Saudi Arabia, 9/11 would be a wake-up call. George Bush made that famous speech right after 9/11 where he famously said, reflecting on 9/11 and the Saudi links to 9/11, that for 60 years we have been pursuing, he said, stability at the price of liberty, and at the end of those 60 years we've gotten neither. Stability, a code word for dictatorship, at the price of liberty, sort of indirectly acknowledging we haven't pursued human rights and democracy, hoping that this equation would stand up to scrutiny, and we got 9/11. So I think, it's a great question. I think it's got to be part of the public conversation in this country. But as you're seeing from the list of people who are meeting, it's not on the agenda. Because there is still, I think, a naive hope that these authoritarian regimes are going to preserve our interests. And I don't think they will at the end of the day for reasons that I mentioned. So I think part of the way forward is to, at least to the extent that there are wise people in government, to try and take advantage of opportunities, this being possibly, let's say, one of them, if you wanted to give the Crown Prince the benefit of the doubt. Okay, he says he wants to modernize and change things. Well, there's specific things that I think are in the interests both of Saudi Arabia and of the United States that he can be doing. The stuff that I mentioned about, reforming religious interpretation, freeing sort of these dissidents from jail, and backing that up not just with words, but with with sort of a serious conversation and consequences. And of course, that's very difficult to do with the Saudis, as Ambassador Grappo will tell you, because they don't want to be told by outside powers, how to run their society. So it's a very difficult. There's no magic formula here. I think it's got to be done in bits and pieces, because the worst thing that could happen is, as bad as I think authoritarianism in Saudi Arabia, we don't want a complete collapse of Saudi society where you get a situation that starts to mirror what we've seen in other parts of the region. Right. So it's got to be handled very carefully, but I don't think there's a magic formula here. I'd like to hear what Gary Grappo has to say on the topic.
Our relationship with Saudi Arabia was never about values. No two countries could be more different when it comes to our heartfelt values. It's all about interests. And the United States has real interests in Saudi Arabia. I hear some folks talk about oil. Oil is an important part of it. Why? Because at one point we, less so today, but virtually all of our major trading partners around the world depend on oil, and the Saudis, probably not quite as influentially as they could before, can still impact the price of oil. And if you begin to cause harm or threaten or in any way jeopardize the economies of Western Europe or East Asia, that's going to have an impact on the United States. But that wasn't the only one. The Saudis were strong supporters of the United States when we were fighting during the Cold War. Belatedly, and I know this from my own personal experience, the Saudis came around to supporting many of our efforts in counterterrorism, and they sided with us up to a point in our dealings with Iran. So we've had common interests, and it was important, therefore, that the United States had this kind of relationship. It wasn't the one we wanted. It's not the government that we would want. But it's the government that's there, and it's the one we have to deal with, and it's the one that, coincidentally, shares many of our interests. They also want to see stable global oil market and a stable global economy. It's good for them. It's good for the long-term viability of the oil industry. So we have a shared interest, and on the basis of that, as well as some of the other things that I mentioned, we have a relationship. Unfortunately, we just don't have the luxury of getting the kind of government we would like to have. No mistake about it, Saudi Arabia is not Canada or Great Britain or Japan or Australia. And it's not going to be. And we have to face that. I have to say, though, that if you go to WikiLeaks, you will see endless exchanges between, particularly in Riyadh, between American diplomats, myself included, with the Saudis about the human rights record. Whether it's the way they treat women, whether it's the way they treat religious minorities, whether it's the way they treat dissidents, you name it. I don't know how many people I personally got out of jail because they were either carrying around a copy of the Quran that wasn't sanctioned by the Saudis or a copy of the Bible. So this is the country that we unfortunately have to deal with. We now have a claimed reformer, and he is doing some interesting things that may change the course of Saudi Arabia to the good. And I suspect that the Trump administration, at least superficially not having a very sophisticated understanding of the kingdom, thinks this is all well and good. So they're going to, well, we are going to provide them with the kind of support we think they need. As I indicated in my remarks from the dais, I'm a little too concerned that we're giving them a blank check. But for the time being, it seems that we do have, we continue to have shared interest, and that is the basis for this relationship.
Let's take 3 questions. Adam, okay, Joseph, and the woman at the front, and then we'll go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your insight on the topic.
Yeah.
This is actually coming from a religious studies perspective.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking primarily of Oliver Roy's Holy Ignorance and neo-fundamentalism. And it's a twofold question that hinges on MBS's basically his effort to dominate the format of Islam globally and the export of Wahhabism worldwide. And Dr. Grappo, you had mentioned that the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia is losing power, the Wahhabist religious establishment. So I'm curious, that's a question within Saudi Arabia. How is his rise to power iterating that same format of Islam, Wahhabism, exporting it worldwide? And that within that, and also, Nader, to your point, how there's no open space for public debate for different denominations. So the interrelation within Saudi Arabia, I'm curious to ask you about, and how there's a seclusion of dissonant perspectives. But also the international relations is the second part of the question in terms of its expression as neo-fundamentalist. Like how do we as state actors and non-state actors outside of Saudi Arabia participate in that process in a way that can help that reforming process?
Gary, you want to take a stab at that?
The phenomena of the export of Wahhabism is a relatively new one, which began in 1979. And I had, when I was there, I had a number of conversations with some pretty senior Saudi leadership who impressed upon me the shock to Saudi Arabia that 1979 was. It was a juxtaposition of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that is, a communist invasion of a Muslim country, the Iranian Revolution, and the rise of a very strong version of Shia Islam, and then the extremist takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And this just shook to the core the Al Saud leadership. What did they do? They strengthened their relationship with the United States, which is something that we embraced given what was happening in Iran. But secondly, they turned to the religious establishment. It's the only protection, the only defense that they had. And that they had to counter Shia Islam. And what is not known is the extent to which Iran has also projected Shia Islam around the world, including places like Latin America and Europe and other areas, maybe even here in the United States. And so the reaction on the part of the Saudis is that we are going to go full bore in promoting Wahhabist Islam. As I said before, they sort of turned over the management direction of education policy and judicial policy to the religious establishment, which contributed to this extremism. Now, Salafism in and of itself, this is the ultra-conservative form of Islam, wasn't violent. But you can see how it could easily evolve into violence, which is exactly what it did. And the Saudis admitted to me, we never anticipated that this would become as violent as it's become, as we all saw here in our own country with 9/11. How do you rein that back in? How do you put it back in the box? They've been trying. Not nearly in as concerted a fashion as I think they could. They have reined in some of their spending. They've sanctioned some of the more extremist imams who have preached a more virulent form of Islam. But until they stop funding the madrasas, the mosques, and so forth that promote this form of Islam, it's going to be here for a while. I think this is a long-term, if he intends to take it on at all, is a long-term challenge for Mohammed bin Salman. I don't think he's going to be able to turn that around very, very quickly. Moreover, as long as Saudi Arabia continues to face the challenge across the Gulf from Iran, they will continue to see this as a lever, as a counterbalance to Shia Islam. And Shia Islam, it's just, and by the way, it's not viewed the same, Wahhabi Islam is certainly Sunni Islam is not viewed the same way in Iran, the way the Saudis view Shia Islam. It is a visceral antipathy that it's hard for any American to understand. They simply become very agitated about Shia Islam and the fact that they are viewed as apostates in Islam, and they feel it as their mission to contain Shia Islam, and this has infected Saudi thinking, and the extent to which a so-called reformist leader in Saudi Arabia can change that, to me, is highly suspect.
Yeah, in terms of the second part of your question, very quickly, I quoted from Madawi al-Rashid, who's a prominent Saudi anthropologist and dissident. She has a book, which I can loan you because it's up in our office, called Muted Modernists, where she talks about the existence in Saudi Arabia of a group of modernist religious thinkers, leaders, theologians who have a much more modern interpretation of Islam. They're all in jail, they're silenced, they're repressed. I think they hold the possibility of, I think, providing and presenting a much more modern interpretation of Islam that the international community can engage with. But of course the difficulty is you're dealing with the Saudi government, you're dealing with the religious establishment, you're dealing with a particular interpretation of Islam that Gary Grappo just outlined. Those modernists are considered to be great. It's also important to point out those modernist voices that are in jail, they're small in number, they don't have a public platform, they don't have the same currency, but they do have the potential, I would argue, because all of them are Saudi citizens, all of them are pious and practicing Muslims, but in many reasons, the reason why they are in jail is because they do have a different interpretation of Islam. So I think therein lies the hope of engaging with Saudi Arabia on the international in the international system with people who I think have much more modernist values than the current Wahhabi establishment in Saudi Arabia. Joseph?
Thank you both again for your presentations. Professor District. I'll let him know later. My question related to a couple of developments this week. The first flight, Air India flight, which was Tel Aviv and Mumbai, which was able to fly through Saudi airspace as well as Omani airspace, as well as not included in the highlights from the itinerary, though I think no one really wanted to make it too public, was that MBS met with leaders from the Jewish community, and not just religious leaders, but as usually been the context for Saudi monarchs meeting with the Jewish community, but now with the political leadership from members of the Conference of Presidents. Does he have the political capital? Does he have the ability within those three spheres, within the religious, the royal family, and the business, to be able to turn the Arab Peace Initiative around, or is it still stuck and is sort of that a bridge too far for the Saudi population as well as for other populations in the GCC for MBS to try to accomplish that?
Do you want to take that?
But I don't know if you saw it, Joseph, but he also met with the leadership of AIPAC. Look, this guy is a very clever young man. He's for someone as inexperienced as he is. By the way, I've met him several times, but he'd always just he was a wallflower in his father's office. He would just sit and listen. And his father was a quite highly respected member of the royal family, Salman, who would be doing many other things were it not for the fact that apparently his age is catching up with him. And so I think he's about changing things. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they may support a closer relationship between themselves and the Israeli security establishment because it's in their interests. Whether this could be carried over to somehow provide some impetus to a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I'm far more skeptical, simply because he can't move against what I like to call the Arab street, nor can any other Arab leader. These are not democracies where the people are going to defer to the leadership, and the people have a choice in their leadership. So they do have to be sensitive to the street, and the Arab street is very passionate about this issue. And any support for a peace plan that somehow is perceived, whether in reality it does or not, to be prejudicial to the interests of the Palestinians, whether it's Jerusalem, whether it's the right of return, and some of the other issues that are outstanding, they're going to become very agitated about. And the one thing all Arab leaders know that can bring people out into the street is the Palestinian issue. Although I will say that when the United States recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, that the response, including in the Arab street, was relatively muted. 15, 20 years ago, there would have been riots, cars overturned, fires, all sorts of things. And I don't know what that suggests other than the people of the Middle East, that is, Arabs, are facing so many of their own crises that they just don't have time to think about the Palestinians. So I don't expect any real significant momentum in that, but clearly it's not a bad thing that they've begun to talk to Israelis. And I suspect that the other Arab countries, well, I know for a fact, I'm sure you do too, the UAE and some of the other Gulf countries, Qatar, Kuwait, are also looking at ways to reach the Saudi or the Israeli security establishment.
Yeah, let me just add to what Gary has said, that I think the cautious optimism that was in your question about potential sort of Arab, Muslim, and Jewish-Israeli reconciliation as represented by the events that you listed is something to celebrate and really sort of try and get behind. I think that is a path that will lead to deep disappointment if it's pursued. Largely because I think supporters of Israel are still doing what they have always done in terms of trying to secure Israel's status in the region, thinking that Israel's stability and safety in the Middle East could be secured by allying themselves and making peace deals with dictators of the region instead of the peoples of the region. And until, and actually what's happening as a result of actually these moves, it's actually, I think, undermining the prospects for peace and stability in Arab-Muslim versus Jewish-Israeli reconciliation. Because the way it's being perceived on the Arab street is, once again, another dictator is selling the Palestinians down the drain. And in this case, there's actually a lot of evidence, because if you know what's happening with the current Jared Kushner peace plan, is that MBS is a big part of it. In fact, he called Mahmoud Abbas to Riyadh last November and basically said, look, there's a peace plan coming down the pipeline, and this is all you're going to get. And what you're getting is not an independent state. You're basically getting a Palestinian Bantustan. You're going to have to accept it. And so the way this is read on the streets in the Arab and Muslim world is that this is another betrayal. Once again, another dictator is selling our interests, no consultation, no debate, and I think it will simply, lead to greater recrimination, animosity, and distance between the state of Israel and the regions, the peoples of the region. It won't actually lead to the opposite. And that fundamentally comes down to the fundamental point that I think most people realize by now, that if Israel wants to be accepted in the region by the peoples of the region, it's got to give a little bit of justice, a little bit of land, a little bit of dignity to the Palestinians. The ongoing colonization, settlement expansion, and then trying to put this Jared Kushner peace plan and force the Palestinians to accept it is simply going to just add fuel to the fire. And I think most reasonable people, see that. So these statements that we're hearing at the AIPAC conference, celebrating MBS, celebrating the United Arab Emirates, celebrating this, the overflights of Israeli aircraft over, Saudi Arabian territory. This is again, it's putting your hope in the dictators of the region and not in the peoples of the region, and it's going to blow up. That's my best.
Palestinians don't have to do anything, just the Jews do.
No, everyone has to do something.
Well, you didn't say that.
Right, but the Palestinians are the ones who are occupied. That's a fact that you can't ignore.
Well, it's a fact that can be discussed at how they got reoccupied.
Okay, yeah, but the fact is they're occupied, and so that's a fact that you can't ignore. But obviously you have ignored that fact in your deliberations, which just suggests, I think, the chasm between your worldview and the worldview of most of the international community. Last question.
And my question does relate to this. As a Jewish American, I feel totally frustrated all the time by the government in our country never listening to the majority of moderate Jews in this country. We all don't agree with AIPAC. And I feel like my voice and many other, the majority of Jews in this country actually, are never listened to. And the only way that this is going to change is if somebody starts listening to us as well as the very, very conservative Jews in this country that AIPAC represents, but they really don't represent the majority of Jews here. You know, I would like to see us talking to Iran. I'm horrified at the idea that we're going to drop out of the Iran agreement, as are the majority of people that I know who are Jewish. But our voice is never heard. And I think until things change in America, nothing's going to change over there. I had one quick thing also. Back in the early 90s, I took a course at the Colorado School of Mines, and the professor there, it was on petroleum geology. And he told our class then that Saudi Arabia was actually on the downside of oil reserves. Well, here we are 25 years later. How much oil do they really, really have? And of course, we really don't need their oil anymore, but I'm just curious because that seems to be a deep, dark secret.
Do you have a sense of what the oil reserve status is in Saudi Arabia?
Yes, they have more than anyone else. That's the short answer. And unlike the Russians and others, they really do know how to manage their reservoirs. The one thing, well, they learned many things from Americans when it came to the kind of managing the infrastructure of their country. By the way, the United States, starting in the 1960s through the 1980s, was present in an enormous way to help the Saudis basically establish a government and build an infrastructure. So those of you who've been to Saudi Arabia know their roads look like ours do, except they're maybe a little more maintained, a little better maintained. Almost everything in Saudi Arabia was modeled after the United States because you had American advisors doing all of those things for them. And the Saudis paid for it all of it, including the salaries of treasury officials, geologists, engineers, you name it. But when it came to the oil, they truly did listen to the American engineers on how to manage a reservoir. The Russians basically suck out as much as they can, as fast as they can. The Saudis don't. The Saudis manage their reservoir very, very carefully. Now, it's very true that their largest oil field, the Ghawar, which was, I think, the largest oil field in the world for most of the last century, is probably beginning to decline. But there are many other parts of the country that are not fully exploited, and they can take advantage of the very same technology that we have done to boost our oil reserves. At the same time that the professor told you about Saudi Arabia, they were predicting we would run out completely. This year, the United States will be the largest producer of oil in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more even than Russia. So I think oil is going to be around for a long time. The Saudis know that too. The Saudis actually want to wean themselves from oil. That is, they don't want to depend on their own oil. They want to reserve that for export. And they want to convert to either renewable oil, i.e. solar. They got a lot of sun in Saudi Arabia. And now they're talking about nuclear. And the United States, as MBS tours the country, is pushing very, very hard for him to do deals with some of the major nuclear power companies in the United States so that we get the bulk of those contracts. But they're going to be in the oil business for a very, very long time.
Great. Okay, thank you, Gary Grappo. Claude isn't here. I'll thank him later. Thank you for your questions. That's the end of the event. See you later.